Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible. This week we're expanding on Sunday's sermon topic dealing with the end times, and today we're specifically talking about palm branches, donkeys, and white horses. I'm Stephen Mizell, and I'm joined by Sheryl, Daughety, and Justin Smith, and our text comes from John chapter 12. I'm going to read just verse 16. It says, his disciples didn't understand at the time that this was a fulfillment of prophecy, but after Jesus entered into his glory, they remembered what had happened and realized that these things had been written about him. So we've been focusing on some concepts of the end times this week, and I understand that today we're going to talk about Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey and how that might point to some end times events. So, Justin, can you briefly tell us what has happened between the time Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead and this passage that we're looking at today?
Yeah, well, after raising Lazarus from the dead in Bethany, many people believed in Jesus, but the miracle also stirred up tension with the religious leaders. Because of growing opposition, Jesus decided to go to a remote area called Ephraim, near the wilderness, and hang out for a while. As Passover approached, people began wondering if Jesus would come to Jerusalem for the feast, since the religious leaders were now openly looking to arrest him. 6 days before Passover, Jesus returned to Bethany, and the next day he entered Jerusalem riding on a donkey, welcomed by a crowd waving palm branches and shouting, Hosanna.
So do you know what the deal is with the palm branches? And did they have any special meaning prior to that?
Yeah, so the palm branches do have some special meaning. In fact, they have a deep national as well as a prophetic meaning if you look at it. So normally palm branches were used during the Feast of Tabernacles, which occurs in the fall. And the Old Testament particularly links the use of the palm branches during that festival if you look at Leviticus 23, verse 40. So the question for us is this: why did this crowd use palm branches for this celebration? So the symbol of palm branches can trace back to the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BC, when Judas and Simon Maccabeus led Israel to military victories against the Seleucid Empire. And then after the Jewish people reclaimed the temple, they celebrated with parades and palm branches. So the palm branches became a symbol of victory, liberation, national hope. So the people are symbolically and publicly crying out for deliverance, especially from Roman rule is what they're after.
So does this mean that the people were declaring Jesus was their hope for political deliverance from Rome?
I think so. The problem is Jesus came differently than they expected, as we know. Jesus was riding on a donkey, and in ancient times, kings rode donkeys when they came in peace and not in war.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they rode donkeys when the battle had already been won. At the same time, the irony of this action was that it actually fulfilled prophecy. Zechariah 9:9-10 says, Rejoice, O people of Zion. Shout in triumph, O people of Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming. He is righteous and victorious. Yet he is humble, riding on a donkey, riding on a donkey's colt. I will remove the battle's chariot from Israel and the war horses from Jerusalem. I will destroy all the weapons used in battle, and your king will bring peace to the nations.
So Jesus riding on a donkey fulfills an ancient prophecy, but does that connect with end time prophecy?
Yeah, so I think the story of the Messiah doesn't end with a donkey. When Jesus came the first time, he came as a suffering servant, right? He was a peaceful king who laid down his life for other people. And prophecy declares that he will ride into Jerusalem again in the future, but this time he's going to come riding on a white horse. Revelation 19:11 says, Then I saw heaven open, and a white horse was standing there. Its rider was named Faithful and True, for he judges fairly and wages a righteous war. So in ancient warfare, a white horse was the mount of a victorious general or a conquering king. And so that's what we see.
So the donkey and the white horse are not contradictions. They're bookends of his mission. The first coming brought peace with God through the cross, and the second coming brings the reign of God through final justice.
Yeah, so what do you guys think it's going to actually be like when Jesus returns riding on a white horse?
I think it's hard to describe, but the words that come to mind are majestic, magical, beautiful, mysterious. It'll look like something that we've never seen before and evoke feelings that we've probably never felt before. I feel like it'll just be a brand new experience.
Yeah, and I feel like, going back to that scripture, that it will feel like a victory. It will feel like a king who has come in victory to reign, and that we will feel victorious in that, and we'll feel excitement that we can't explain, but probably a lot of holy fear at the same time, if we really understand who he is and have any concept of what's going on.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to comprehend what it's going to look like. Whatever I describe, I even think whatever John described in the book of Revelation is limited. And I think it is going to be a great moment of victory. That's how I see it. So when some people read passages like this, they talk about being afraid. So do you feel afraid when you talk about the end times? Why do you? Why do you not?
I personally do not attach it to a lot of fear. And I think it's because, again, I just recognize how little of it I can understand. And I'm not sure how much of it we're going to comprehend as we're seeing it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's gonna be so fantastic and so hard for us to comprehend that we're just going to be in a state of awe more than fear. And I also, we've had our lifetime to establish that trust and love and relationship with him, which I hope would see us through that too, that we would still have that same feeling, but probably even stronger because he's going to physically be in front of you.
If I'm being completely honest, when I was much younger, there was a time when I was probably terrified of being prepared for Jesus' coming again. Had I done enough right, or was I living a good enough life? But as I have grown and matured in my faith, I realize that there's nothing to be afraid of. It's beyond my comprehension of how wonderful it's going to be. And as God has proven his faithfulness to me through various circumstances in my life over and over again, I know that he's always going to be faithful. So thinking about end times is exciting because I know there's something far greater in my future for what this world holds for us now.
I still experience fear, and I'll explain that in a minute. When I was younger, very similar to you, there was always a fear that Jesus was coming back and I was going to get left behind, scared to death. Especially in the environment I grew up in, hell was more real than heaven, I think, in much of the things I heard. Now, for me personally, I don't have any fear about the end. For me, the fear that I have today is for others. Is my family ready? Will my grandkids know Jesus? Do the people I love? That's the fear I have today because I still believe heaven is real and hell is real. But if that's the case, I don't want to see anybody perish, and I know that's a reality. So that's the difference I still have fear today, but the fear I have today is that other people are going to experience it, not me, in the end. So, in our services, typically, even on Palm Sunday, because we typically don't do a big thing for Palm Sunday. We don't use palm branches, typically in our service. But are there other ways that our actions during a worship service might be interpreted as a cry for deliverance or for the return of the King?
I think that truly disconnecting yourself from distractions and focusing on God through singing, raising your hands, praying, taking communion, are real connections to God and knowing that He's a higher power than anything that we can experience ourselves.
Yeah, and I think about worship not only as an act of like physical worship, let's say if you're talking about worship music, something along those lines, but I also think about worship in the terms of our lives and how we live them in acts of service, how we're using our time. And when we choose to worship anything, we are recognizing it as greater than us, as our source of hope, as our source of contentment, as our source of peace. And I think that when we live our lives in that manner, we're showing that that's what we believe about Jesus as our Savior, when we are making Him, our source of hope and the thing that we're worshiping. And I think I also think about prayer because in that same way we understand how much of our lives is totally out of our control. And we go to Him asking for many types of deliverance for ourselves and for others. And so I think that just prayer in general is also a really important act of worship.
In the worship service in general, any of the things you've mentioned, whether it's lifting our hands, kneeling, standing, and when it comes to prayer, I am much more comfortable kneeling than I am in any other position. That's just me, But the songs we sing, even the choice of the songs, are they directed toward Jesus or are they more about us? I think our daily obedience is critical. Just surrender to do His will is a challenge for most of us. I think most of us, even especially in our prayer life, we're praying for deliverance at times. God, even so, come quickly. And I know I have a friend. When he prays, every time he prays, when he closes his prayer, that's how he closes his prayer. Even so, come quickly. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.